and welcome. This week on my Aught series, I am going back to 1954. This was the year that the Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, were published in the UK. Also the year Lord of the Flies was published. This is the I Am Legend is published. But there's also a fantasy novel that doesn't get talked about as much that I decided to visit, and it was brought up along with Fellowship of the Ring as being an epic fantasy called The Broken Sword by Paul Anderson. Now, I looked up Paul Anderson was kind of a prolific fantasy and sci-fi writer. He's an American writer, and he won many awards. He was part of like a fantasy writing guild of sorts that he helped put together. So I was very interested in this because it was brought up as a fantasy that came out at the same time as the Fellowship of the Ring, and kind of comparing what fantasy looked like across the genre, because it's not just Tolkien that was writing at the time. Okay, this book had 10,000 reviews on Goodreads. I know it was published way before Goodreads, but any reviews since Goodreads have come up. There's 10,000 reviews compared to the same publication year of the Fellowship of the Ring. We know how popular that is, has 3 million reviews or ratings, I believe. So this one kind of flew under the radar a little bit, but people who are big fantasy fans seem to know about it. So I was able to get this book on Libby. I did it as an audiobook. It was pretty short. Let me see. This was 8 hours. And I believe this was the edited version, because Paul Anderson did go back and edit The Broken Sword and add some things that he felt like he wished he had put in the first time. I believe he edited it in the 70s. The original publication was 1954. So I think that's the version that I had, because this is the 2011 audiobook that I got off Libby. We'll start with the kind of book summary. This classic fantasy takes listeners to a world similar to that of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Thor has broken the sword Tyrfing so that it cannot strike at the roots of Yggdrasil, the tree that binds together earth, heaven, and hell. But now the mighty sword is needed again to save the elves in their war against the trolls, and only Skafloc, a human child kidnapped and raised by the elves, can hope to persuade Bolverk, the ice giant, to make Tyrfing whole again. But things are never easy, and along the way, Skafloc must also confront his shadow self, Valgard, the Changeling, who has taken his place in the world of men. A superb dark fantasy of the highest and most Norse order, The Broken Sword is a fantasy masterpiece. Okay. So I was expecting big epic fantasy from this. So it was interesting to me that this calls this a superb dark fantasy. A lot of what I saw on Reddit when I first heard about this book was people talking about how this book, you could probably call it the precursor to grimdark, which I don't do well with grimdark very often. I liked the beginning of Game of Thrones. After the Red Wedding, I was not really interested anymore. Joe Abercrombie and some of the others, I haven't found one that I like yet. So I was a little weary on that front, but I was very excited for the epic fantasy that kind of sounded like was going to be happening. In that summary, it makes it seem like the sword is going to be this important piece of the quest line. And it's not. It doesn't show up for a very long part of the story, probably 75% of the way in. This novel was very much an exploration of kind of your identity. There's nobody that's really inherently good. Everybody has flaws, I guess is the best way of putting it. And a lot of the characters are kind of unlikable. So it's very different from Tolkien, who is very hope-filled, and everybody seems like, except for maybe Boromir and a few others, you get a little bit of that conflict with Tolkien, but not as strongly as in this, where pretty much every character has some sort of flaw with them, and everything is up to fate. And with the gods interfering, it's like how much were they really relying on their own will, kind of thing. The story started with the narrator, Bronson Pinchot, and he read an introduction that said, "This is a romance," which really threw me for a loop. Um, even before this started, because I was expecting epic fantasy saga, and to hear this is a romance, it was interesting. Spoiler: there's there's a romance, but it has problems. Um, Speaking of spoilers, anything from here on out, I'm going to be speaking directly to the plotline. We start the story with Orm the Strong. He is the fifth son in his family, and he traded with two of his brothers. He traded the land that he was going to be inheriting with them for 3 ships, and he and his 2 brothers went off to do Viking raids to loot around the world. Um, at some point, Orm the Strong ends up marrying Elfrida, and she is from a Christian family, and Christianity is kind of a subplot in this story, a little bit like the Mists of Avalon, where Christianity is starting to spread through the northern European countries, and the almost battle between the Christian religion and the old gods. But Orm ends up marrying Elfrida, and she was unwilling pretty much at first, pretty much for their whole marriage. You're going to find out later that she had some different opinions afterwards, but she was not willing, which is unfortunately the sad reality of a lot of women at this time in history, because this is taking place in the northern European countries, Britain, Finland, etc. Elfrida ends up bearing Orm the Strong a son. And then we cut to the elf named Imric, and he is the elf earl of Britain. And he visits a witch in the forest, and she tells him of the Danes coming and tells him about Orm the Strong's son, who is unchristened at this point. So he's kind of unprotected from the elves being able to take him. And Orm had burned the witch's son, and she wants revenge, so she's willing to help Imric. And Imric decides that he's going to ride out to where Orm is and look upon the child. When he does that, he solidifies his plan that he is going to kind of try to hold back Orm by doing a changeling and swapping Orm's son for a changeling child. Once he has decided this, he goes back to his own fairy castle and goes deep down into the castle dungeons to where he is keeping a troll woman behind a door with 3 locks, and he has kept her there for 900 years. So she has been imprisoned for 900 years, and she is not mentally well, as you could imagine being stuck in a dungeon for that long. Imric tells her that they are to make a changeling again. So you kind of get the picture that Imric has forced this woman to create a changeling for him before, and she is kind of why he keeps her. Or, excuse me, that is why he keeps her. And she kind of prattles on in nonsense, so he whips her into submitting to bear another changeling. After she does that it's like it happens in a few minutes or happens in a few paragraphs. I don't remember exactly the timeline, but the troll woman kind of gives birth to this changeling child, and she gives Imric a prophecy as he leaves about this child. So Imric goes and puts the changeling in and swaps it out for the human child of Orm. So Imric takes this baby, the son of Orm, back to Elfheim, and he gives this baby to his sister to foster, and they name the child Skaflock. And Elfheim celebrates the arrival of this child. They treat him like a gift. At some point, a messenger of the Aesir, the gods, comes and gives a gift to Skaflock, and the boy is raised to wield magic. He befriends goblins, that were actually defeated by Imric, but he befriends them. He learns to fight and does really well. He hunts and he's just a flourishing child in this elven community. And at some point he comes across a fawn. And that fawn tells him of how Christianity is pushing out the old deities and creatures. And so this fawn has had to run. There was also an interesting note about elves at this point, where elves hate daylight and can't touch iron. So I think the iron has kind of continued into current fantasy to some degree as a weakness of elves, but I hadn't heard the daylight one before. It's very vampiric. Skaflock grows older, and at some point, Imric takes Skaflock to have him make steel armor, to have the Dwarf King make steel armor for Skaflock. And the Dwarf King makes it a point to scold Imric for creating this changeling child and taking Skaflock without permission, because he thinks it's going to create a problem for those in Fairy soon, which is definitely right. Skaflock, though, is very bold and impresses the king while he's there, so he kind of soothes the Goblin King's woes at that point. And 6 more years go by, and Skaflock keeps growing into a full adult. At this point, Imric starts taking Skaflock on many raids, and they become very famous amongst the land. So then we go back to the witch's point of view and get her for a moment and get a little deeper into what happened to her. And she raised a child. He was killed by Orm, and so she wants to wipe out Orm's children after he destroyed hers. And that kind of segues us into Valgard's upbringing. Elfrida never really liked Valgard from the moment he was, as she thinks, born to her. And dogs, the animals in the village don't like him either. There were dogs that were killed because they were trying to attack Valgard as soon as he was born there. But that kind of makes Orm think that this child is going to be a strong, strapping man, and that people are going to fear him, and it's going to be great for them as Vikings, or as raiders, rather. He does grow up to be a very mean boy, and his mom, Elfrida, does not like him at all, as I said. But she does have 2 more sons and 2 more daughters with Orm. And she treats them much differently than she treats Valgard, which starts to alienate him and create more problems with him as a character. So Kettle, one of the brothers, is out on a hunt, and he becomes separated from their group, and he comes across a cottage in the woods, and he stays there for 3 days with this woman, this beautiful woman. He kind of loses track of time in this, and Orm is now worried about his son not returning with the rest of the hunt, and he sends out a group and is looking for Kettle. And Valgard goes out as well. Valgard is the one that finds the cottage in the middle of a sleet storm. When he gets there, he ends up in a confrontation with Kettle and kills him for the woman. He wanted this woman, and he knew that Kettle had been bedding her throughout these days that they were looking for him, and now he wants her. Immediately afterwards, he does show remorse. Valgard does, and he wants to bury Kettle because he realizes that it was a very emotionally charged moment, and that he hadn't wanted to kill Kettle. That was the consequence of his choice. Valgard, so Kettle spent 3 days with this woman. Now Valgard stays a week with this woman. Valgard came back to the village for a little bit, and then he does go back out to the cottage because he can't stay away from this woman. And Osmond, their other brother, follows Valgard back to this cottage. But then we cut, and Valgard returns again to the village. Valgard returns again to the village, and Orm, at this point, presumes that Kettle is dead because he's not been found yet. And they prepare a funeral for him. But now Osmond is missing, and we had cut from that Osmond found the cottage. So now you can infer that maybe Valgard might have killed Osmond. Maybe. That's what I was thinking at this point. But during the funeral feast, I guess it was, Osmond kind of like busts in the door and has a grand entrance, bringing a guest, they said, just the body of Kettle with Valgard's axe in his skull. And Orm thinks that this is a trick, that Valgard could never have done this. He is the only one that likes Valgard because Valgard is the type of manly strong that he wants in his children, even if that means that he's cruel. So he thinks it's a lie at first, but then Valgard immediately sends a spear through Osmond, and Orm's like, "What the heck? I was just defending you." Osmond is now dead, and this starts a major fight between just Valgard and all of Orm's men and Orm. Valgard ends up slaying his father too. So he's taken out 2 brothers and a father at this point. And that's where we cut at that point. So Valgard ends up going back to the witch again at the cottage. I don't think he doesn't know that she's a witch. She's just a beautiful woman in the forest. And she tells him of his changeling origins. Like, she knows about it. This part is where I first started getting inklings of Mordred, other than the religion aspect, this is where the story really started following Mists of Avalon for me. Or following's the wrong word because this came out 30 years before Mists of Avalon, but it started reminding me very much of Mists of Avalon, where Mordred finds out that he's Arthur's son because his aunt tells him, and she had been manipulating Mordred and Morgaine throughout the entire story. This is where I start getting inklings of the Mists of Avalon. And the witch prepares him to take on the elves and align with the trolls so that he can kind of reclaim his lost identity as a troll and hopefully be able to be more welcomed than he has been as a human. And this is the first point as well where you're starting to see these crises of identity between some of the characters being with Valgard, and then you're going to see it mirrored later in Scaflock. Valgard is still kind of on the fence. A lot of his life has changed at this point, and he's still he still has some remorse about what he did to his family. He grew up with them, and even though he felt very much like a black sheep, he still was not reveling in their murders at all. And he kind of wants to stay in the safety and comfort of this woman's cottage instead and kind of hide from everything that he's done. So the witch reveals who she is and kind of takes off her glamour, and she reveals herself as this haggish looking woman. The cottage isn't even a cottage. It's just like it's disgusting, and he can't believe that he's been there this whole time. And Valgard ends up saying a curse to this witch as he takes off. So Valgard starts to make a name for himself as a raider without Orm, his father. He does want to take over Orm's stronghold. So Valgard goes on one little raiding mission, and he goes from England to Finnmark for some gold. And then he decides that he wants to take Orm's stronghold. So he does go back. And at this point, the women in his family have prepared a funeral for, now it's not just Kettle's funeral, it's Kettle, Osmond, and Orm, all of them together. And they're being buried in the hillside with all of their riches. And Elfrida at this point, this is where you hear her change. This is the first time you hear from her directly, I guess, about her marriage and what she feels about Orm, because she was forced into it. But at this point now, she had been with Orm for like 20 years, and she is feeling strongly that she wants to join Orm and her 2 sons in the afterlife, we'll say. But her conflict is that it wouldn't be Christian to do so. That's against her beliefs, is that it would be a sin to take her own life. And she felt by the end of the marriage that Orm really did love her, and he wasn't just a brute. Valgard, much like Osmond, bursts into this funeral, and he starts slinging blades and killing more people. And he collects his sisters at this point because he thinks that his 2 sisters are going to be a good gift to the Troll King and kind of start the relationship between him and the trolls. And you can infer what I mean by gift, as these are women, young women. So he takes his boats back out, and he uses the power of the witch's wind to change the winds and move back to Finnmark. It was 3 days and nights of travel. This felt very Odysseus with the wind in the sheep skin, I believe. It's been a long time since I've done Odysseus. And the trolls are waiting in Finnmark, and Valgard's men are fighting on the beach, but Valgard stays back on his boat, and the trolls are killing his men to the point where there are no more men left. But he allows them to be slain by the trolls, kind of as another gesture of goodwill. And he is taken with his sisters to the Troll King. And the Troll King, we find out, is his grandfather, because the Troll King is the father of the poor troll woman who's been kept in Imric's dungeon for the last 900 years. He went from being a chieftain, or Valgard went from being a chieftain's son to now being the Troll King's son. Very similar stations at this point for him. So at this point, the elves want to go raid Trollheim, because they feel that the trolls are getting out of control and are encroaching on their territory. Skaflock has been raised as this incredible human being and has known no wrongs at all in his life, and he has so much hubris at this point and is extraordinarily overconfident about going. His elf mother Leah begs him to stay. She's like, "You're gonna get hurt. This is not your fight. You're still human. You are a great human, but you're not an elf and you're not a troll." But Skaflock insists on going. The elves come across the men who were slaughtered by the trolls on the beach. Skaflock leads the charge into the Troll King's hall and meets Valgard, and he comes in, confronts him, and sees his mirror image. They look exactly alike. And they have a kind of 1v1 battle moment, and the elves are able to beat the trolls back into the cave system out of the throne area. Their Valgard's sisters get left behind. The trolls don't end up taking them, and they are saved by the elves. And the sisters are actually initially afraid of Skaflock because he looks like Valgard. They realize immediately that he's very different, that that he is the golden son kind of that Valgard wasn't. So it confused them at first, but they recognize the difference immediately. Freya is immediately attracted to Skaflock. Now, as a reader, you know that Skaflock is a changeling and was Orm's son, and that means that Skaflock is Freya's sister, is Freya's brother, which somehow, even seeing with their own eyes that Valgard and Skaflock look exactly alike, Freda never questions this at all and just immediately falls head over heels for the good version of her brother. And they are going to fall in love. I guess this is the love story part that was the romance that was written about in the introduction of the story. It's, again, very Mists of Avalon, except they are falling for each other of their own will, whereas Morgaine and Arthur were manipulated into their relations. So the elves start retreating back to their ships, but the trolls were able to get out of the cave system and kind of cut them off on their way to the ships, and they're outnumbered 6-1. But the elves are still master swordsmen, and they get a lot of their warriors out. They did have heavy injuries, or heavy casualties at this point, though. Skaflock and Valgard meet again before Skaflock's able to get to the ships. And Skaflock injures Valgard, but the Troll King intervenes before he can kill Valgard and slams Skaflock in the head. But the elves end up making it to their ship, and Skaflock is presumably brought onto the ship by some of the other elven warriors. Frida wakes up in Imric's castle with Skaflock, and they both kind of again make mention of avoiding that Valgard is a twin in looks to him, and they flirt a lot, and then immediately they kiss during a tour of the castle. Leah, the elf foster mother, the sister of Imric, on first meeting does not vibe with Frida at all, and she warns Skaflock that Frida is a danger to him, and he's like, that's not there's no worries here, mother. I'm not getting what you're putting down. I'm not picking it up at all. Um, and I'm gonna pursue this woman because I like her. Skaflock ends up going out hunting because that's a thing that he likes to do. And he comes across, they're still back in Elfheim. He comes across Tyr of the Aesir. And Tyr warns Skaflock that there's a lot at stake and the Aesir are troubled about what's coming. And he asks Skaflock who his father is, and Skaflock doesn't know. And Tyr tells Skaflock pointedly to keep it that way. Avoid finding out who your father is. And because when he finds out, it's going to bring a darkness. The darkest day that he will ever know. So Tyr is already preparing Skaflock in a way for the inevitability of finding out that this new love of his life is related to him, and that it will be devastating when they find out about it. But he doesn't know that. He's still kind of like, well, that was cryptic. I didn't need to know who my father was to begin with. I'm cool. Imric comes back to his castle and finds out who Frida is. But he also says he can't tell Skaflock. He's like, this is weird. I'm not telling him. But Imric tells Leah that he is going to get rid of Frida. At this point, Skaflock starts commenting in his kind of inner thoughts about how he never realized how lonely he was amongst the elves, being the only human, and that there were some differences between him, even though the elves did a lot in his upbringing to make sure that he didn't feel as a part. But because he was human and had different limitations of the elves, there were differences that he didn't fully recognize until he came to interact with humans more, which is really just interacting with Frida more. And he talks about Frida filling a void for him and filling like a missing part of him that he never knew he had. Gross. This is the first time also of many that Skaflock starts making comments about Frida that are, in this day, particularly disgusting, quite frankly. And he likes that Frida is still more girl than woman, that she has not filled out a womanly body. He likes that. That's really gross. Anyway, so then we cut back to the witch, and she is running from the wild hunt. I believe Imric might have sent them after her. I can't quite recall, but she is trying to escape them because her vengeance isn't complete. Orm's children are still out there. And she tries to call on the Dark One to help her escape the hunt, but he couldn't care less about her life. He's like, you've served your purpose as a witch, and I'm not stepping into this. And hounds tear her apart from the hunt, and she curses the elves as she dies and tells the hounds to tell Imric about Valgard. She tells the hounds to tell Imric that Valgard knows who he is. So Valgard, we switch to his point of view, and he's in Trollheim, and he is now the king's grandson, but he has no friends here. He's still a very unlikable person, but he does make use of his station, and he plans with the Troll King on how to overtake the elves. Then we go back to the elves again, and they are preparing to go to war with the trolls. And Frida makes a big point of telling Skaflock that she doesn't want to be left behind at all. And he's like, okay, that's fine. And then they go feast, and there's a battle dance with the elves where the women are dancing with the swords. Dancing around the swords, and Leah, kind of manipulating, asks Frida why she doesn't dance, and then Leah throws herself into the blades and kind of showing off, and like, this is how a real woman prepares the elf men for battle. The dance ends, and Frida is still fine. What Leah was trying to do was get Frida to jump in, and that doesn't occur. Skaflock ends up giving Frida a vial of poison before they leave for battle in case the elves lose and she's taken. She is to poison herself so that she's not taken by the trolls. So they go to battle in England. Skaflock and Valgard immediately seek each other out, just like Mordred and Arthur did on their field of battle in Mists of Avalon. The elves, they lose pretty handily. It was not a good fight for them at all, and they pretty quickly have to go back to their ships. And Imric at this point declares that England is lost to the elves. The trolls are going to take over his castle. Imric is no longer the Earl of Elfheim, and he worries now that the trolls are going to take the rest of Elfheim as well and go to the rest of the elven castles. Skaflock runs to save Frida. He turns to run to save Frida before the trolls get to the castle. Then we do find out that Imric wasn't dead. It was a pretty quick resolution to that, and he is chained with the other troll captives, the other elves, and Leah, before Skaflock can make it back to the castle, Leah comes to kill Frida and scares her about the trolls and what they will do to a woman if she's taken. And Leah offers to take Frida to a church instead, and once they've argued a bit, she ends up backing down and decides to say that she will take Frida to a church instead, which is kind of nice. But Frida refuses on this, and she doesn't want to give up on Skaflock, and she ends up assembling what she thinks Skaflock's going to need to continue fighting back, and leaves the castle. She goes out with 4 horses and supplies, and she runs from the trolls trying to find Skaflock. And she immediately runs into him, pretty much. Leah she stays at the castle. She surrenders it to the Troll King. All those captives, including Imric, are taken to the dungeons. And the Troll King still has plans to take the rest of Alfheim. Leah recognizes Valgard at this point, and she is already trying to be really crafty and use Valgard to potentially get Frida out of the way. She's just really intent on Frida not being there with Skaflock at all. Gora is what the name of the troll that was held in the dungeons previously, what her name was. And she is brought up from the dungeons after 900 years of being down there. And the Troll King immediately recognizes that she's insane. And there's no saving her, and the merciful thing to do for her is to kill her. So he just orders that, and then because of what he saw had happened to his daughter, he orders that Imric is chained by his thumbs above hot coals in the dungeon. So Leah wanders around the castle. All the elf women have pretty much submitted themselves to the trolls, and Leah gets into Valgard's bed, which is basically her sleeping with someone who looks exactly like the boy that she fostered. Gross. And she starts getting under Valgard's skin, and Valgard ends up killing one of the trolls in Leah's defense. And it's Groom? I think it's Groom. Who the Troll King had left in charge of Imric's castle. And so when he kills him in defense of Leah, Valgard takes the crown on for himself and crowns himself the Earl of Elfheim, or the Earl of England. Excuse me. So Skaflock and Frida end up going out and surviving in the wilds. They leave the castle as taken by the trolls. And again, we get a comment about Frida's boyish body that he likes, and she is at this point wearing trousers, so she's not wearing dresses, and it makes her look more like a boy. Gross. Again, Skaflock, the more time he's spending with Frida, is feeling more and more human, and Frida is feeling more and more elven, strangely, because of her exposure to Skaflock, who was raised in the elven ways. Skaflock wants to go back and get his sword that was gifted to him by the Aesir when he was a child, but it is hidden in the castle, of course, and he wants to go get it, but Frida feels that there's a terrible omen over this entire idea and begs him to not go, but he is stubborn and does not listen to women, and he also thinks that Leah being in the castle still will help him, and that she will be able to help get him to the sword that he wants. Frida is going to be stationed outside the castle. Skaflock leaves her there because he doesn't want her taken by the trolls. And he turns into a wolf. That's one of the magical things he learned with the elves to infiltrate the castle. He also turns into a bird at some point, and I believe one other animal. But this was the most descriptive chapter that there had ever been. Everything else had been so, like, macrocosmic, and what was happening just in the pace was just a lot quicker, so we weren't stopping to notice details about anything. But then this chapter, when he turns into a wolf, we're talking about the wind on his fur and how that felt, and we kind of sat on it for a few pages, which never comes back in the book. So it was a very stark difference to how the rest of the writing had been. So Leah is sleeping in Valgard's bed, and when Skaflock comes in, and she kisses Skaflock full on the mouth, and he mentions that she's beautiful, even though he has Frida, and she was his foster mom. Like, what is with this? I don't I don't like. Leah threatens to tell Skaflock who his father is unless he kisses her back, and he ends up doing it just to get her to keep moving, but it's weird because he had literally just said that she's so beautiful. She helps him pull the sword from the wall where it was hidden, and this sword is Tyrfing, and it is broken. It's the weapon of the gods, the hope of Elfheim. Leah also tells Skaflock that this weapon is cursed, and he should put it back. Like, she's trying to warn him not to take this weapon. But he, again, does not listen. He needs to go find the giant, Bolfric, to reforge the sword. And Leo takes one more skip. Skaflock gives one more kiss to Leah, and then takes off. Frida, while she was waiting out in the woods, she's trying to be as brave as she can because they're dark, scary woods, but an old stranger comes up to her with one eye, and this is Odin. Odin says that he can save Skaflock as long as Frida pays the price, and she must give him what's behind her girdle, and she thinks that that is the poison that's hidden in her girdle. I immediately knew this was going to be an unborn child, but Frida thinks it's this poison vial. Odin, when she agrees, sends help to help Skaflock get out of the castle. Frida, when she reunites with Skaflock, also immediately notes that the sword is evil, and they end up having relations again because she knows it's their last night together, and they just put aside all of their fears and worries and enjoy each other. Afterwards, they ride hard back for Ormsland, and Frida's mother is just sitting there. It's been a few years, I believe, at this point, and she's much older. She's just looking out at the burial mound of her husband and her two sons. And she also thinks Skaflock is Valgard when Frida comes back with him. Frida and Skaflock came back there so that they could call Orm, Kettle, and Osmond from the grave and talk to their ghosts. Because for some reason, Orm, Kettle, and Osmond know where the giants are, know where the giants live, and that's where they need to go to get this blacksmith to reforge the sword. And Elfrida sees the ghost and cries for Orm to take him with her to death, but he kind of calms her down. The brothers give directions to the giants and also reveal the big reveal that Skaflock and Frida are siblings. And Frida doesn't take this well at all. For her, raised by her Christian mother, she also was baptized and she followed the Christian religion. She feels this is a sin. And she is just beside herself and tells Skaflock that this is the end for them. Skaflock tries to convince her and pretty much says, like, it doesn't matter. We weren't raised together. We're not actual siblings, even though we share the same blood. But she calls him a heathen, and she leaves for a Christian haven instead. Kind of like Guinevere in Mists of Avalon after she feels like she was manipulated into laying with Arthur and Lancelot, and then she ends up in a convent too. So Skaflock, very upset, ends up going to a council of the chiefs of Luthen. These are like the gods of Ireland fleeing after the Christian god came, and they say that the sword carries a demon and will be the bane of Skaflock to wield it. The Tuath de Danann pledge themselves, as well as other gods, to his cause. And he sails off to Jotunheim to see the giant. He ends up traveling with Manon the Sea King. And they are attacked by a worm in the sea. They keep moving across a glacier, but hear like loud clanging in the distance, and they have to get past a guard hound without killing it. And then they end up coming to the giant smith with no eyes. So this is the part that gets really Nordic saga. I felt, because now we're like really, it's not just the elves. We're really going on a dangerous adventure, and there's the gods are involved, and we're deep in to the different lands of the Nordic legends. So the smith drenches the blade in venom, and he reforges it with the dragon rune sword. Wulfric also warns Skaflock that the end of the world is nigh, and the sword will eventually turn on him. He's like, this sword, if you're gonna listen to anybody, listen to me. It's not a good sword. But Skaflock's like, I have to take this. I have to take this and get the troll kings out, or the trolls out of my foster father's castle. And Loki finds out about this, and he wants to intervene and sends creatures to chase Skaflock out of Jotunheim. They don't catch up with him, but they have a even more dangerous time getting out than they did going in. And at this point, Manon and Skaflock comment on how they don't know how long they've been gone from into Jotunheim, but they do note that they left in winter and now it's spring. And Skaflock is looking extraordinarily ragged from this journey. But he goes straight to the castle in England to fight Valgard, the trolls, and the Troll King. Oh, he goes straight to England to fight Valgard, the trolls, and the Troll King at another elven castle. So the Troll King is already making moves to try to get into or to remove another elf territory. And by the time Skaflock gets there, the troll army is already overtaking the elven castle and have sieged it pretty much. Skaflock immediately jumps into the fray and kills the Troll King. And the king, on his dying breath, tells him that it's the devil and the sword doing this, not you. Which, it's really interesting that Skaflock gets this weapon that kind of absolves him of any responsibility for anybody he slays with it. But Valgard, everybody that he slayed, he felt conflicted about it, but it is presented as his choice, his fault. But for Skaflock, he is being wielded by the blade rather than the blade being wielded by him. So we get back to Frida, and she goes to the Christian convent, and she's at the haven, and Frida refuses to confess her sin to the priest, but she ends up confessing it in her own prayer between her and her god. And she talks about how she still loves Skaflock and wallows in self-pity about it, about how he's her brother. Then Anderson, the author, makes more comments about her body changing and that now she is more woman than girl. Still gross for the third time. And then it does note that as she's becoming more woman than girl, she is becoming a mother. She looking like a mother. And immediately after that, it's confirmed she's pregnant with Skaflock's child. She does get a proposal for marriage from a man in the village that she's staying in, and he wants to care for her. He doesn't care where this baby came from. He does seem to actually love her. He's an awkward little golden retriever puppy, but he warms her to him eventually, and they do become engaged. The trolls, after the battle that Skaflock kills the troll king, start to kind of fall apart, and they're sort of under Valgard's rule at this point. But they don't have strong leadership anymore after they've lost their very old king that had been in charge of them for like 1,000 years. And the elves are starting to fight back with Skaflock's return. Valgard at this point goes down into the dungeon where he still holds Imric, who's an immortal, so he won't die from this. He still holds him over the hot coals and whips Imric in a drunken rage and says, "I hate you for bringing me into the world." And kind of takes all of his rage out on Imric for everything that has happened to him. And Leah tries to calm Valgard, but he's not having it at this point. And he says, "What am I but the shadow of Skaflock?" He feels like he has been compared to Skaflock in every way, even with Leah, with Imric. He wasn't supposed to have been born. He was just born to take the place of Skaflock. So for him, he had no purpose in life. And he says, "I am a ghost conjured into flesh." It's very sad what poor Valgard had to go through. So Skaflock gets the Elven Earl King, not just the Earl of England that Imric was, and moves across and starts taking out the trolls in England. But the more battles he gets into, the more withdrawn he gets, and it's becoming more noted that the sword, every time it's unsheathed, is just bloodthirsty. It is driving him to be very cruel in his battles. But the elves are like, this is a guy we can get behind. He's got incredible fey prowess at this point. And then we get everybody joining together. So all of those Irish gods that the council that Skaflock had spoken to, they arrive to help the elves, and Manon is back as well, is taking Scotland. Monanon. I think I've been saying that wrong the whole time. Monanon. There's a lot of N's. Skaflock and Frida reunite, and immediately the author writes, "The old hunger filled their eyes," even Frida's. And Skaflock thought that this man was a threat to Frida, so he starts to draw the sword, and that immediately fills him with the demon's power as a vessel, and he kills Frida's new fiance. And it's, again, not seen by him as directly his fault. He feels it's the sword. And Frida tells him to get out. Good for her. And Skaflock calls her a whore. Lovely man. But then he turns around and tries to ask her for a kiss. He's like, "Oh, that was wrong of me. Forgive me." But she's like, "No." And he leaves. And she gives birth right after he leaves to their son. But she still loves Skaflock after all of this. And he just killed her fiance. Odin comes to collect. And she is confused. And she suddenly realizes that it wasn't the poison. It was the child. And Odin takes her child. And she tries to compel him away with her cross like he's a vampire, but he's not affected at all. And he takes the baby. As he's leaving, he tells Frida that Skaflock must die and the child must inherit the demon sword, which kind of hints that there would be more to the story, but I don't believe anything else was written in this world for Anderson after this. But there could have been more with Skaflock's child. Now we're back to Leah in the Elven castle that are still held by the trolls and Valgard. And Leah sneaks around the castle and cuts Imric free, healing him, and then tells him to release the other elves. And then she goes and she flings the keys out over the castle walls because the other British elves are starting to come to siege the troll castle and block them in. So she throws the keys to the castle over the side of the castle wall so that they can retrieve them and break into their own castle. Frida after her child is taken from her, rides with a broken body to the castle. Like, she just gave birth and she's riding, and it's taking everything out of her to do this. Then we cut back to the final battle and Valgard being betrayed by the elven women. Leah got all the elven women ready, and they started slaying trolls in their beds. Then they're on the battlefield, and Frida immediately comes to Skaflock in the middle of battle, and it distracts him because he's fighting Valgard. And Valgard swings a sword at him and then kills him. Like, Frida comes, Skaflock is distracted from swinging at Valgard. Valgard kills him. And then somehow, in the way that he swung the sword, it went up into the air and comes back down and pierces himself. And he kills himself with the same swing of the sword that killed Skaflock. Valgard felt that he was the shadow of Skaflock, so he has to die with Skaflock, I guess. Also, a very reminiscent to me of the scene in Mists of Avalon with Mordred and Arthur fighting to the death, and Morgaine being there as well and having to mourn both of them on the field. Frida kisses Skaflock goodbye as he dies, and then Leah comes out and wants to slay Frida, because she was pretty much Leah thinks that Frida was the reason that Skaflock died this whole time. But Imric is like, no, this woman's been through too much already, don't kill her. And so they don't, I presume. And then Imric says he's going to throw the sword of Tyrfing out to sea so that nobody can get it. And that's where the story ends, with their death. Now, this was very much an epic Nordic saga. I felt like it was more in the vein of, like, a Beowulf. One of the things that bothered me in this was the portrayal of women. It did seem like kind of a blind spot for Anderson. Those characters they were there to propel the male characters forward and not really have their own agency in a way. They kind of felt like afterthoughts. It just, I don't know. I didn't feel very comfortable with them most of the time. The women in the story often functioned as romantic catalysts or political pawns and victims of violence. None of them were really on their own quest doing their own thing. They had no goals for themselves, kind of things. So with the women in this story, I had a lot of issue with the way that Frida was portrayed. Not just the brother-sister relationship, but how she was described frequently as being boyish or not quite a woman. And it was gross and bordering gratuitous already with the way that the relationship was. So I really did not enjoy that at all. And then on top of that, having Leah, his foster mother, throwing herself at him, I guess it was an attempt to not lose Skaflock, but it also came out as gross and incestuous, and it was just, I don't feel it was necessary to the story at all. How this book influenced today, Michael Moorcock is on record talking about how this book really influenced his writing, especially Elric of Melniboné, I believe it's called. That book I DNF'd. I tried it. So I'm not sure how much kind of inspiration he drew from that. He speaks about it, and he also speaks about how he believes that the Broken Sword is superior to Tolkien. And in that regard, I don't even think that Tolkien and Anderson were playing in the same sandbox. They both rely a lot on European mythology, specifically Nordic legends, but their tones, their focuses on the characters are totally different. Like I said before, Tolkien is very hopeful and about and beating back evil versus very intentionally good people, or very clearly good people, and how you can overcome this and working together as a fellowship. And there's just a lot more hope in Tolkien's stories. And then this was a lot more that the gods are kind of taking over the will, and there's fate that's over you. And it was looking much more internally at the identity piece for each person. All of the characters being so much more morally gray. There's not really anybody that's like a cute little hobbit. There's no one like that. Everybody's flawed, like I said. So I don't think that they're playing in the same sandbox, and that you can really say that Anderson was better than Tolkien or Tolkien was better than Anderson. They're very different, despite having been influenced by a lot of the same mythology. One series I was thinking about the whole time I was reading this that I love so much, that's you could, I guess, say might have taken some influence from The Broken Sword, is The Elven from Bernard Hennen. He's a German fantasy writer. So we have The Elven. It's a pretty thick one. We have Elven Winter is book 2, and Elven Queen is book 3. These are definitely following the same Nordic saga vein that Paul Anderson did. These are all in the same universe. They're not exactly the same storyline. This one, The Elven, pretty clearly finishes what was going on in The Elven. But these two have the same characters, the same world that happens later. It's just a different story at that point. I love these books. When I read The Elven, I had to wait a few years for Elven Queen and Elven Winter to get translated into English, and it was a long wait. I love these so much. So I think if you've read Broken Sword or think that Nordic sagas are really interesting, that The Elven is something that you should probably pick up if you haven't read those. I was thinking about them a lot while I was reading The Broken Sword. They are not grimdark at all. They're more of the saga, the epic saga kind of thing. I love this series. So anyway, back to The Broken Sword. I appreciated reading something that was kind of a precursor to modern fantasy, because the big fantasy explosion happened in the 70s, and it was cool to read this thinking about that this is published the same year as The Fellowship and Two Towers and Lord of the Flies, and kind of all the different ideas that were going into fiction at this time. I don't really think I can say I enjoyed it a lot. It's not a favorite book. I appreciated it for what it was, but it's definitely not something that I'm going to be looking for a special copy of at all to put on my shelves. It probably is in the same way that I haven't found a grimdark that I really like. It was just some narrative devices, as I said, that I don't enjoy reading. But I appreciated it for what it was. I am glad I read it, and I'm looking forward to the next one. So I don't know what should my next book be? I'm not sure what my next book might be. I might read The Magician from Raymond Feist, but I do have 3 books, because I have the 3 that the Broken Binding released. But we'll see how long my current Origin Stories video takes, because that one, I have 2.5 more books to get through for that, and I might need another standalone fantasy for Aught. But I'm really enjoying reading fantasy from published before the 2000s, and getting a lot more of that kind of almost fantasy history. So leave a like and a follow if you'd like to hear more as I keep reading these stories.